Mr. Attorney General, you are the highest ranking Sikh public official in the United States in a generation. And you're the chief law enforcement officer in New Jersey. And to be perfectly frank with you, as someone that spent nearly a decade in politics, I was never even sure I would see someone like you until I was, much older. And what I would love to get at, because I think the whole Sikh community, quite frankly, around the world has gotten acquainted with you, or at least has heard of you. I want to take a step back and really kind of understand how you got to this position. So I want to start when you were kind of growing up, because you grew up in a very different time in the United States. There was a huge influx of Asian American immigrants. The culture today is in some ways, particularly for young people, much more, favorable to and understanding towards young people, right. That are diverse. What was it like for you growing up?
So first of all, I'm just happy to be part of this podcast, and I'm happy that you're putting this together so others can not just hear about how I got where I am, but how other Sikhs have achieved success in whatever discipline that they're in. You're right. When I was growing up, I was born and raised in New Jersey. There were not many Sikhs in this community. I'm not too far from where I grew up right now. We're in our Newark office today. But we would get excited when we go to the shopping mall and see another Sikh family. I mean, that's how few of us there were, right? And so at that time, you were always the first Sikh in your elementary school. You were always the first Sikh, in whatever activity you were participating in. You were always the first in middle school, high school, you name it. You walk around, you stood out. And so it was a much, much different time, and different also in the sense that we did not have the organized presence we have today to help explain who we are and to help explain our faith traditions and our beliefs and the concerns. We didn't have a Sikh coalition. We didn't have a national Sikh campaign. We didn't have SALDEF. We didn't have United Sikhs. We didn't have all these organizations out there lobbying on our behalf. So we were our own lobbyists, and we weren't very good at it. And so we fell short. And I think we sort of retreated into our comfort zones, into our gurdwaras, into our communities, and that's how we sort of dealt with the outward pressures that were coming at us. So it was entirely different than where we are today, which is very much more of a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, much more of an accepting society. Despite everything that's going on in D.C., we're still in a much better place than we were when I was growing up in New Jersey.
Right. Were you ever bullied?
I mean, bullying was, it was just every day, right? Oh, wow. I mean, it was, it was different when I was I went to elementary school initially in a town that I went to kindergarten in, and I went to, I knew everybody. So we all grew up together. And so it didn't really hit me then, even though I was the only Sikh at a Catholic school, believe it or not, Our Lady of Good Counsel. I got exempted from Mass and all the other religious classes that everyone else had to take. But I grew up around those kids, and I grew up in the same neighborhoods as they did. And so it was never an issue. We just knew each other as, I'm Gurbir, you're Steve, or you're Joe, or whatever the case may be. When I moved in 5th grade, and I went to a community where they didn't know any Sikhs in the 5th grade class I entered, it just, from the get-go, it was like, who the heck is this guy wearing this batka? Why does he have that on his head? Who are his parents? Why do they speak with such a funny accent? What do they believe? And then, you graft on top of that everything else that's starting to happen. I always like to say, the only time I felt like an outsider in that, before 5th grade was, when we had, Gaddafi and others and certain world events, or the Persian, not Persian, but the Iranian sort of interference, and I guess it was the oil crisis or whatever it was back then. That's like everyone would look at you like, oh, you're them. But yeah, I mean, I was in 5th grade when I moved, and that's like, you know, when you're in an environment where you didn't grow up with these kids, it was just constant, whether it's, you know, name calling, whether it's physical, and it took a while. And for me, it only subsided when I started playing sports and I excelled at sports, and then you developed, you know, that's where people don't see color, really. Like when you're playing on the same team towards the same goal. And then that became my crutch, and that got me through.
What sports did you play?
I played soccer, I played basketball growing up, and I played tennis, and I excelled at tennis. And but it was really the team sports like soccer and basketball, and then just having that group of friends, you know, who had your back when you were on the field and who had your back when you were in school. That was certainly something that got me through that time. And then in addition to that, I mean, I think, you know, it was the Gurdwara, right? We established a Gurdwara here in New Jersey, in Bergen County, in Glen Rock, where I now live, and you started to meet other families, and you started to meet other kids your age, and you started to support each other. So, you know, you became your own support networks. And for me, that was, you know, meeting Amr and Ravi Balla, right? Ravi was my age, Amr was a few years older than us, and that we just formed such a bond at that early age. Before there was even a Gurdwara, we would meet, there was a tent there, and we would meet there, and while our parents, you know, did kirtan inside, and we were outside playing baseball, and just there for each other, and we commiserated with each other, and, you know, shared sort of the experiences that we were experiencing in our, you know, different schools and our different lives, you know, a few miles from each other, actually, from where we grew up, maybe 5 or 6 miles from each other.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because, well, you know, the New York Times highlighted this friendship, which is, you know, New York Times doesn't really highlight that many friendships. But I want to bring it up not because of that article, but one of the episodes that we're going to have on this podcast is with Dr. Marwa, who was Dalip Singh Saund's campaign manager, who, you know, really since he was the highest ranking Sikh public official. And him and Bhagat Singh Thind, who very famously took his case, who fought in World War I, took his case to the Supreme Court to become a citizen. They actually were all friends.
I didn't know that.
I did not know that. When I did the interview with Dr. Marwa, I did zero research because we didn't know we were going to do a podcast at that time, and he told me, yeah, we were all friends and we lived like relatively close to each other, and we would. At that time, the big debate was immigration policy with Lyndon Johnson in the Civil Rights Act. And they would get together. Yes. And they would get into, like, go to a basement like uncles do, and they would talk about how do we get this thing passed? What can we do? And, you know, they obviously had a hand in passing it, and it helped bring most of our community here. But I say all this because when I read that story, I immediately thought of those three. And I just think because you, Ravi and Amr have all done very monumental things for our community in the United States. Ravi becoming first turban mayor, yourself, and then Amr started the Sikh Coalition, which is, you know, marquee organization.
17 years ago this week.
Yeah, I don't know if you had any reflections on that, or.
You know, I think, you know, certainly we supported each other, right? Which I mentioned earlier, because we were all experiencing, you know, forms of bullying and intolerance in our own communities. And when we got together at the Gurdwara, we were able to just sort of get each other through those moments. And I think, you know, those experiences, being a Sikh, you know, just being, I always say this when I have an opportunity to talk about it, that Sikhs are really natural born public servants, right? That Dr. King talked about it in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, right? When he talks about the interrelatedness and connectedness of all of us, of humanity, what happens here affects someone there, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These are concepts that we grow up with, right? These are concepts that are fundamental. And so when you experience injustice, when you are, grow up in a tradition where there's a value placed on fighting, against injustice, I think that sets really sort of the foundation for you to go into public service. And I think Amr had a passion for it, and he was older than us, and he was sort of our role model growing up, that he went to law school. He went to Case Western, not too far from me. Yeah, he went to Case Western. And
I'm from Cleveland, audience.
Yeah. So
Case is in Cleveland.
Yep.
Sorry,
So he went there, and he was very passionate about public service, and we just sort of looked to his example. And
That's so cool.
and then we both went to law school at the same time.
Yeah.
Ravi was at Tulane, and I was at William and Mary. And I think, you know, it just set the example. And we didn't, you know, Amr went to a firm right after law school, but, you know, there were other triggering events later that really brought us into public service. And I think it was similar for all of us. But it was, you know, that early friendship, I think, you know, you share values, you share concerns about what's going on across the world, what was happening in India from a civil rights perspective, from a human rights perspective, what's happening in other parts of the world, and then growing up in a tradition that really prompts you to speak up and fight against injustice. I think that set the table for us to pursue the careers that we did pursue. Right,
so you think that aspect of Sikhism is what inspired you to get into that line of work?
I think it's certainly, you know, like I said, it sets the foundation, right? When your spiritual beliefs and your political beliefs and your professional work can all line up, I don't think there's anything more satisfying that you can do. And that's why I say,
I totally agree.
That's why I say that, you know, we're natural born public servants, and it's a shame that more of us in the Sikh tradition don't go into public service. And that's the sort of struggle for all new immigrant generations that come here, that you know, your parents come here for better economic and educational opportunities, and then they want you to take advantage of those better economic and educational opportunities, and then they want you to succeed professionally.
Right.
You know, it's a traditional thing. I don't know your parents, but I'm sure it was be a good doctor, be a good lawyer, and if you're not going to be either of those, be a good engineer.
Yes.
And no one ever says, you know what, Beta, if you want to be a cop, be a great cop. If you want to be a first responder, be a great first responder.
Right.
No one ever, you know, pushes you there because, you know, they fought so hard to get here and put down roots so we could achieve success educationally and professionally, that you're always pushed in that other direction. And you're seeing that shift now. But you know, I think hopefully as more and more folks see the value of it and see how, you know, Ravi going into public service, Gurbir going into public service, whoever it may be, not only are you doing tremendous good, but it's having such a wonderful benefit, I think, for the rest of the Sikh community, that others can think that such careers are possible for them. And then you're just ambassadors too, that, you know, I'm the chief law enforcement officer for a state of 9 million people, right? I have supervisory authority over 21 county prosecutors, 30,000+ law enforcement officers. I mean, we set the policy here through Attorney General's directives, through training. That's decided on a signature, right? So we could say we want implicit bias training for all law enforcement. We want cultural sensitivity training for all law enforcement in this state. And to be the face of this office, looking the way I do and believing what I do, I think that has such a residual benefit that we might not realize it, but you're impacting law enforcement. When you're impacting law enforcement, you're impacting communities. And so, you know, as more and more of us get into public service, I think hate, intolerance, all those things fall by the wayside, right? Because you're just part of the system.
100%, 100. And sometimes we are our own limiters. And I'll give you a story. Like I remember when almost exactly how you described it. I wanted to get into public service when I was in college. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I knew I was not smart enough to be a doctor. Like I would not be able to get through like however X many years of school. I was just wasn't going to be able to do it.
Right.
And but I knew I was inspired by Barack Obama. And I told my dad, I was like, you know, I want to try to work for Barack Obama. And he looked at me dead in the face. He's like, you're not going to get into politics. You're no one looking like you, like with his life experience, which I think at that time was rational.
Yeah.
If you look at it from his angle, it was like, you are not going to make it in politics. Politics, no one looking like you is going to work at the White House.
Right.
And he ended up being 100% wrong. And but I had to, if I would have listened to him, which I'm sure many of their parents did listen to their parents, not saying that you shouldn't listen to your parents.
But we are our own limiters.
Yeah, we can sometimes we can limit ourselves in what we're capable of, and I think what gets me excited about people like you and Ravi Amar is that it not only challenges that, but it creates space for the older generation where they have almost every belief to the contrary to take a step back and say, you know what, go ahead.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
100%. I mean, you know, the amount of sort of focus we've placed, or the generations before us have placed, on building institutions, on building gurdwaras, on building, you know, the organizations that they built, tremendous money was spent on all of that, which is important, right? But I think Ravi's campaign probably did more to inform people in this state, and probably throughout the country, about who Sikhs are and what our beliefs are, right? And you know, I think it's not that we don't have to build institutions. We also have to build political institutions and foundations where we could have sort of a launching pad to pursue these careers, because, you know, again, it goes back to the residual benefit. Not only is Ravi engaging in public service, he's also promoting Sikhs and what it is, and promoting acceptance. So I think it's huge.
Yeah. So how did you decide to go into public service? Because you were in a situation when I decided was far more fraught than I was. Because there was literally nobody. There was no Barack Obama. There was nothing.
Yeah.
Right. There wasn't anybody to really.
Yeah. Yeah. You know. So I say, you know, that we should push more people to public service. You know, I was victim of being that, you know, big firm lawyer, where, you know, I went to law school, and you know, I had it always in my mind that I wanted to do something to give back, whether it was like through a pro bono opportunity or, you know, through volunteer work. But you know, I was attracted to the money too. And I went to, you know, one of the biggest firms in DC. I was making more money than I probably needed. Had a nice house, and then the triggering event for me, the real wake-up call, was 17 years ago this week, right? On September 11th, I was working in D.C., and I'm sure you have you know, your own experience to share, but for me, it was, you know, going into D.C., you heard about the planes hitting the World Trade Center. You're starting to get all this news filtering out of what's actually happening. I worked at 12th and E Street in Washington, in the Warner Theater building. We went up to the roof because we heard about, you know, planes hitting the Pentagon. We're looking at all this happening around us, right? And we're looking at the news, and just horrible, horrible tragedy striking the United States. And you know, you see all your colleagues starting to grieve and come together, but you start getting pushed out subtly, right? Yes. You're not sort of included in that grieving process, and then, you know, stares and murmurs. And I remember my mom calling me that night saying, "You should stock up on groceries." You know, they were living up in Jersey, and I was down in D.C. I'm like, well, why do I need? Like, I got plenty of groceries at home. I'll be fine. And you just started to hear these stories about Sikhs being targeted, and Muslims being targeted, or anyone who didn't look American enough being targeted. And then I think, you know, going to work, you know, it was just sort of difficult. You know, you're in the nation's capital, you want to grieve with everyone, but you're also like on edge a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And so, you know, and then the building I was working in, there was a homeless guy, Jimmy, who would frequent the different corners around the building. And, you know, I'd be with firm partners or clients as a young associate there, and I'd walk out, you know, going to lunch, and then, you know, he'd start yelling, "I found bin Laden, I found bin Laden, I got him." And, you know, he just, and everyone's looking at
you, and it's just so embarrassing.
And so all of that is a long way of saying that, you know, September 11th was a wake-up call for a lot of folks, for a lot of reasons. And for me, it really triggered the question that why was it the case that I was born in New Jersey, you know, I grew up in New Jersey, I played every high school sport, little league sport, you know, checked all the boxes, did everything you're supposed to do, you know, ideal childhood, you know, lots of friends in college, everything, law school, you know, was on the student government and everything. And then I wake up one day where I'm just made to feel completely un-American,
Right.
and as a complete outsider, and
Right.
as associated with people who were responsible for these attacks. And then you wonder why that's the case, and it goes back to what I was saying. We've done a wonderful job succeeding in so many different areas, except in those areas of public service and first responders, those jobs that are so intertwined with what it means to be American,
Yep.
where you're visibly doing things that folks associated with what it is to be an American.
Right.
And maybe that's that was just my thought process, and so I thought, well, what can I do at this point? I really want to do something, and so I decided with my law degree, one of the best things that I could do. People were motivated to join the military or go into military service.
Right. We couldn't do that.
Yeah,
Actually.
yeah. So we couldn't do that at the time, so I thought I want to be a prosecutor. I enjoyed being a trial lawyer. And so I started applying to pretty much every U.S. Attorney's office on the East Coast, and I got offers from a number of them, and ended up becoming a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn. That allowed me the opportunity to get up in front of juries, in front of grand juries, work with federal agents, work on terrorism cases, work on national security cases, work on financial fraud cases as a Sikh, looking the way I do. And then in my mind, I'm thinking, those 12 jurors that I got in front of and just tried this case, I tried a lot of cases, I got to say that I was Gurbir Singh General and I represented the United States in this matter, right? And what's the retort to that?
Right.
Right? Like, how do you tell that you're a federal prosecutor putting bad guys in jail, vindicating the rights of the United States in cases, representing the United States, and it just built from there.
1,000%. Yeah, no, I that really resonates with me, because when 9/11 happened, I was very young. I was only 11 or 12 years old, so I didn't really understand the global and political significance of it until like a year or two later. But I immediately understood the significance to our community.
Yeah.
Because my dad stopped going to work.
Yep.
Kids would start looking at you weirder.
Yeah.
And it's weird, like you said, you're an American, so you're grieving because your fellow Americans have passed away. But I think the way you described it is perfect. You're kind of subtly pushed to the side that like you're not really an American.
Right.
You don't fit what it means to be an American, and it hurts because I personally, my parents are from India, and I enjoy going there, but I think of myself as an American first.
It's the only country.
I grew up, yeah, that's it. This is it. This is all I know.
Yeah.
Like, when I go to India, it's more of a novelty than it is like, this is my home, right?
Yeah.
And I remember as a child that hurt.
Right.
I didn't have that much awareness, but I knew that was painful. And
it's interesting that the response from a lot of our parents' generation was almost this, I used to call it this like prophylactic patriotism, that they would start putting flags everywhere.
Oh my God! So I was just gonna say this. So I would, you know what I do, because I have the same thing. I would I had a little bike. I would ride around the neighborhood. I put an American flag on it, so like people wouldn't look at me weird.
Yeah.
As a 12-year-old, I just kind of saying out loud for the first time. But now I'm like thinking, man, that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But that's what you had to do.
The first time. Yeah. I was at the Gurdwara, and there was like an uncle who had an American flag decal on his passenger window, and it was like right in the middle of the window. I'm like, why do you have that? He's like, well, if somebody looks at my car, they'll see the flag, then they'll see me, right? And so that, in a very basic way, that's what I was trying to do in a larger way, right? Like, instead of just putting the flag out there as a symbol, why don't we do things that intertwine ourselves in what 100%. It means to be an American, 100%. And to me that was public service. And
one thing I want to mention, I want to ask you more about your career in public service and what you're doing as Attorney General, is one thing that I noticed is growing up, and the results of the campaign have confirmed it, is that the values that we were fighting for as Americans after 9/11 and just in general were so, I had noticed growing up, so tightly aligned with what our community aspired to: equality, gender equality, racial equality, religious tolerance. And I felt like if we communicated that in addition to just putting a flag, it would change people's minds. And I always suspected that. But in New Jersey, actually, we ran our first focus group in 2014, years before we launched the campaign. And this was just a theory that I had. Now we were putting it to the test. And we were in a focus group. I can look in and people see them, but they could not see me. And we just kind of told them about our values. And first we showed them pictures. And there was one moment, this time the Tea Party was very big. She described herself as a Tea Party person. She saw a picture of a Sikh, said, never want to see this person in their neighborhood, wouldn't want them near their kids. It was just like, she was the first person to act, she had the most like viscerally negative reaction. And I was like, well, not surprised, but I'm glad we're seeing this. Other people were not as viscerally negative, but as she found out that we believed in gender equality, as we found out that we're willing to fight for people that are not Sikhs, and as we believed that in racial equality, you could kind of see her mind, something was going on in her mind. She wasn't saying anything, but something was going on. Then you go around at the end of the focus group, and they go back and basically kind of get their opinions of what they thought of all this information. And then she's like, well, how do I convert to Sikhism? So not the purpose of the exercise. We don't believe in converting people, but it was just showed the power of our values.
Right. And we just haven't been good messengers.
And we had not been communicating. So that's why I felt like what you've been doing is so effective, because it effectively does just that.
Right.
And so on that point, you went through 9/11. You are now the chief of law enforcement. Fast forward 17 years later, you were the face of law enforcement of the state that neighbored where this event happened. How? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but how does the fact that all that you had experienced growing up about what we just discussed, to now being the face of law enforcement in just 17 years? I mean, do you have any, like, do you ever, I'm sure you ruminate on that or think about that, or you?
I think it's incredibly, it's surreal at times, right? It's a little bit overwhelming that I, when you start thinking about it. And I think when it first really hit me that everything had come full circle, that what was just sort of a little idea to go into public service, to be a line prosecutor, which, you're just on the line. They call you line assistant U.S. attorneys, right? A line prosecutor in Brooklyn, then a line prosecutor in Newark, and working your way up through the office and running a unit, and running the cyber crimes unit and the financial crimes unit. And then a Republican governor tapping me to become the Bergen County prosecutor, Governor Christie at the time. And that was in January of 2016 when I got sworn in Bergen County. And a couple months later, I got invited to speak at Ground Zero.
Oh, wow.
And I got to speak at Ground Zero to launch what's called the Police Unity Tour. It's done during Police Week each year. I think it's in April. And they start a bike ride from there all the way down to Washington, D.C., to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, the Fallen Officers Memorial, to raise money for families of fallen police officers. But it launches there, and it starts with Chapter 37, which is named for the 37 Port Authority police officers killed at Ground Zero. And they invited me to speak because a couple of detectives from my old office were part of this group. And I spoke from a podium right next to the monument and the memorial for the two towers, right? That's when it just sort of overwhelmed me. Like, I got through that moment, I'm like,
That's pretty nuts.
an event that sort of triggered me to go into public service. Yep. Now it's come full circle.
Yep.
I'm here as a chief law enforcement officer for my county, Bergen County at the time, a county of 1 million people. And they've invited me back every year. And I did it every year, and they invited me back this year as Attorney General.
Right.
And it's just remarkable. And I think that just shows you how much progress we made. I think it shows you what the power of just one person getting involved in public service can lead to.
Right.
And it's incredibly overwhelming. I don't think I've ever, 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 ever imagine that I could end up in this type of position. I don't think, you said we're our own limiters, right? Everyone was limiting us, right? We were only told only a handful of options were available to us. We could be the best, like, surgeon, or we could,
Right.
hate to go back to that. I never thought that I'd be here. I never thought I'd walk into a building where they'd have my picture downstairs.
Right, and when I saw your picture next to Governor Murphy's, I was like, that's crazy.
And so I never thought it, but guess what? It is possible, and hopefully others see that it's possible for them too.
Right. I want to get into some of your priorities as Attorney General. One of your biggest priorities is improving relations with law enforcement and minority communities, particularly the African American community. What have you been doing on that front since you've been in office?
So, I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. I just came here from the basement of a church in Paterson, New Jersey, where I met with black clergy. What I've been doing is meeting with a lot of community stakeholders across the state. We have put into action programs. One of the things I'm most proud of is something we call 2121. It's a 21 county 21st century policing tour. We're mandating all of our 21 county prosecutors to hold 4 community meetings in the community, to go into basements of churches themselves and talk to community members. And that's 84 mandated community meetings with the idea that more will follow.
Right.
And the importance there is that we've seen all across the country that there are huge divides between law enforcement and community in some places. And we've seen that there's mistrust and there's fear and there's all sorts of issues. And I don't think we have that wide of a gap in New Jersey, but the thing is that it's still a gap.
Right.
But that gives me hope, because you could bridge gaps and you could bridge divides. And you bridge them by building trust and accountability, and you bridge them by promoting understanding in a friendly setting, like the church basement I was in this morning, because it's easier to do it there than by a yellow police tape after a shooting.
Yep.
And so we started these 84 meetings, and we did them topically. The first quarter we talked about officer-involved shootings, because we didn't want to run away from that topic. It's happening all across the country. It's a flashpoint. We wanted to come up with a program where we could explain, this is how we train our officers. If there's a shooting, this is how we investigate it, and this is why you should trust the outcomes. And we are the people who will be making those decisions. Ultimately, the Attorney General reviews every officer-involved shooting in the state,
right,
to make sure that if it's lawful, we say it's lawful. If it's not justified, we present it to a grand jury. We want you to understand the process, and we want you to understand why we run it out this way, why we can't share certain information early in an investigation. So that was the first quarter. The second quarter, we talked about opioids. The third quarter, this quarter, we're talking about immigrant rights and immigrant trust. And the last quarter, we'll talk about bias crimes. So encouraging dialogue is important to improve those relations. And the other thing is, through those Attorney General directives that I talked about, we put out directives to produce trust and accountability. We're sharing videos of officer-involved shooting cases proactively. In other words, we're not sitting on them and waiting and trying to say, we're going to fight you if you take us to court before we turn this over. We're saying, let us run out the initial investigation, then we'll turn it over. Good, bad, or indifferent, we want to promote trust.
Right.
And we issued that directive in February. Early warning systems. We put in systems in all of our police departments in the state to identify bad officers. We've put in systems to do drug testing of all officers in the state. It was never mandated across the state. We did that just to promote trust.
Right. See, policy can just fix a little
trust.
Gaps like that.
Yeah, trust and accountability. And it's just an important part of the message that we want to send, that we want to be as transparent as possible where we can. And then, another piece of that is we're standing up a conviction review unit, a statewide conviction review unit. We want to make sure our prosecutors did their jobs the right way, and if they made mistakes, we want to find out why that happened. And so where there are claims of actual innocence, we want to put into place mechanisms to review those cases. If there's new technology we could bring to bear on old convictions, that's something we're standing up. We have a group that's put together to figure out how to identify cases for that unit to review.
Right.
And so we have a former Supreme Court Justice from New Jersey leading that effort, and we'll announce that soon. And the final way we're improving relations, which I can control, I'm responsible for a department of 8,000 people. 13 divisions to include the state police, which is 4,000 individuals, 2,800 troopers, 1,200 civilians. We are putting into place real diversity action plans on how we are going to improve the diversity of law enforcement, specifically state police. We are training all 8,000 employees on implicit bias, to include our prosecutors, to include our state troopers, to include our detectives. And we are taking steps to have diversity in our suppliers too. We have $35 million in outside legal spend. We want to make sure that our suppliers are doing the right thing too, the law firms that we use. So it's just all those actions, policy, like you said, policy can have an incredible effect, but it's also just meeting people, right? Just and I don't really pass up an opportunity to do that, because not only am I forwarding the agenda of the office, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think it's incredible that a Sikh can go into the basement of a Baptist church in Patterson and talk to a room full of Baptist ministers about law enforcement policy. That's amazing. And so if you touch 20 or 30 religious leaders, or it's a multiplying effect. And that's always in the back of my mind.
I think what sometimes people struggle with policies, usually not any single policy is a silver bullet, but a compilation of policies can make a big difference, particularly over a long period of time.
And just not, New Jersey is unique too, because the Attorney General's office is considered one of the more powerful offices in the country, because we have complete criminal jurisdiction, and we're also the lawyers for the state. So no state agency can have its own lawyers. They all have to go, with a couple exceptions, but they're all in the Division of Law, which is under the AG's office in the Department of Law and Public Safety. So you have the ability to set policy for law enforcement, which has a huge impact on folks. And you don't have to go through a legislative process there, or a rulemaking process. It is literally,
take months to years.
No, it's literally writing a directive. But even when we write those directives, whether it's on body cameras, use of force, the way I operate is I bring everyone to the table. So we're doing an immigrant trust directive on how we operate and why we don't cooperate with federal civil immigration authorities to really build trust with our immigrant communities. We have the ACLU at the table. We have Make the Road New Jersey at the table. We have the Police Chiefs Association at the table. We have the PBA at the table. We're talking to the wardens. We're collaborating. We're all not going to agree. That's the understanding, but we're all going to be heard. And then I'm going to make the policy that I make. And then when I sign it, it's policy.
Right, absolutely. A couple more points on policy. A big piece of policy that I know our community is concerned about is immigration, particularly pieces of the rhetoric and now the actions that are coming from the federal government. I kind of want to ask you a two-part question here. As someone that comes from an immigrant family, just on a personal level, what are your feelings on that? Because it's my belief that immigration is the lifeblood of our country, and it's unfortunate to see that. And then what are you doing substantively as AG to address that?
Sure. I mean, I think, on a personal level, having been the beneficiary of the immigration process in this country and seeing how it works and why it works and the value of it, ultimately that gives you more reason to fight for it, right? You are the beneficiary of a policy, and so are we all, right? At the end of the day, but we realize it as new immigrants. So when I look at family separation, when I look at zero tolerance, when I look at the way we're treating people, when I look at the residual effects that it has on law enforcement, meaning that it's pushing people into the shadows. We talked about trust for a long time. We spend so much time going out there into these meetings and to build trust. And when you have a federal government that is driving immigrant communities into the shadows, when it is making it more difficult for victims of crime to come forward, immigrant communities are victims of crime too. And when you're scaring people from testifying, that undermines everything that we do in law enforcement. And then, just as human beings, I have 3 kids, 3 little girls, 9, 7, and 5. There's going to be a time when they're older, probably in 10 years. Sometimes, I think, hopefully it's later, but in 10 years, they're gonna ask me the question, You know, Dad, what did you do when they were putting kids in cages?
Right.
What did you do when families were being separated? What did you do when we were promoting this rhetoric where we were pitting communities against community? What did you do, you know, when the president was dehumanizing people left and right? I want to be able to say, we held the line as attorneys general, and we fought back. And so what am I doing? You know, we're putting together this directive that I mentioned, that where we're going to give guidance to all 30,000+ law enforcement in the state, and that guidance will start from the point of view that we in state law enforcement enforce state criminal laws. We're not here to enforce federal civil immigration laws. There are certain circumstances under which we could ask you about your immigration status, but we will never make that the basis of stopping anyone. And here are the limited circumstances under which we can inquire about your immigration status after arrest, right? And so it can never be the basis for stopping somebody. So we're spelling out those parameters. We're spelling out how we're going to cooperate in jails. You know, are we going to let ICE just approach folks in state prisons and state jails or in county jails? Or are we going to have informed consent? We're going to let the inmate know that ICE wants to come talk to you, or you have the right not to talk to them, right? So we're figuring all this out, and that's what's going to be borne out in this directive. That's policy, right? And then using the litigation tools that we have, we're fighting the administration in court. You know, New Jersey intervened in the DACA case in Texas. The federal government was being sued by the state of Texas and other Republican attorneys general to declare DACA unconstitutional, the 2012 memorandum. And because we were not parties in any of the other prior litigation, because the prior administration chose not to get involved in that, we were able to intervene as a defendant. We said the federal government is not going to stand up to defend this policy. They're complicit in this. Judge, let us in and fight this preliminary injunction. And we did, and we won.
Oh, wow.
And that preliminary injunction motion was denied. There'll be a longer fight, but we're standing up for dreamers, right? And so we're standing up against any policy that the administration is pushing in the courts, or position that they're pushing in the courts. So we're standing up against a travel ban. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court on travel ban version 3.0 went the other way, but we fought that every step of the way. So we're going in the courts to stand up for immigrant communities, for our dreamers, and we're standing up for them through policy. And then, as just a small note, I swore in my second week of office, the first dreamer admitted to the New Jersey State Bar.
Right, that's awesome.
Yeah, Parthiv Patel, and I saw him last night at an event, and I'm just happy to see that he's, you know, has got an Esquire at the end of his name, that he's a member of the New Jersey State Bar.
Right. I mean, to me, I think what people sometimes struggle with is that what makes America great in the eyes of the world is that no matter who you are, no matter what corner of the globe that you come from, you can literally come here and reach the highest echelons of society, like you have done. Like you have.
That's the American dream.
Exactly. And what people talk about the American dream around the world, and I don't think people truly grasp, even our own citizens, maybe even when you're 2 or 3 generations in, totally understand how much that dream is valued around the world. And not every country has that opportunities.
Not at all.
So when I heard this rhetoric attacking immigrants, to me, my initial thought was like, well, this is attacking what makes America great.
Right. I mean, that's the promise of the American dream, right? That
100%.
No matter where you come from, what you look like, what you believe, who you love, if you work hard, you could achieve success here.
Right.
And what undermines that more than that rhetoric that you're talking about?
Right. And on that point, you know, just objectively, there's been high levels of corruption within the current administration. Even today, the campaign manager for the president has just agreed to cooperate with the Special Counsel Mueller. Because you're within the, you know, close to the jurisdiction of the president's properties, and just, you know, New Jersey, like you said, is one of the more powerful AG positions in the country. What are you doing to fight back corruption, not only in the executive branch, but just political corruption in general? So,
I mean, political corruption has been a problem time immemorial, right? And particularly in New Jersey.
Right.
We've had a pretty sordid history in this state with scandal. So interestingly enough, this week on Monday, we announced the creation of something that we've called the Office of Public Integrity and Accountability within the Attorney General's office. And I recruited a former federal prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Tom Eicher, who used to be the chief of the criminal division there in New Jersey and the deputy chief U.S. attorney most recently, to lead that office. Tom was the lead prosecutor on the House banking investigation scandal, which resulted in the conviction of 5 congresspeople, I think, if not more, the sergeant at arms. He prosecuted Jared Kushner's father in New Jersey for tax issues in the last decade. And he's led, prosecutions of councilmen in this state. So he brings a wealth of experience to that office. But what we did is we put that office in a separate silo. We took it out of the Division of Criminal Justice, and their reporting chain, he'll have his own detectives, his own assistant deputy attorneys general, his own staff, and he'll report directly to me. And that's meant to insulate it from influence from anywhere else. And so this elite unit will be tasked with looking at corruption across the state, in no matter the space, whether it's in law enforcement, whether it's in government, whether it's in local government. And they're going to take a hard look. And they're going to also look at other more sensitive investigations, like civil rights investigations involving police officers, internal affairs type of investigations. And you touched on issues related to the president's properties. If there's criminal activity here and we have venue over it, we certainly will look into it without getting to the specifics of investigations, which I can't, as a prosecutor, tell you if we're looking at a particular defendant or a particular issue. But suffice to say, if there's a nexus to New Jersey, if our laws have been broken, and if we've the ability to hold people accountable, we will.
What surprised you most about this job?
I think the sheer scope of it, the sheer magnitude of the office. We sort of touched on my trajectory on how I got here. I was very happy being a county prosecutor. I never, New Jersey is an appointed attorney general. You don't campaign for it. It's one of 7 states that does, 7 I think, that don't have elected attorneys general.
It must feel good not to be a politician and have all this.
It's amazing, right? Yeah, it's amazing. It's a federal model, right? It's a federal model that you don't want your attorney general out there campaigning and raising funds from defense lawyers and from private interests. So I was, I tell the story and I'll share it with you. We have something at Disney World that they call Jersey Week at Disney. And they call it that because there's the school teachers conference here. And they do it on a Thursday and Friday so you could take a vacation. And all of Jersey more or less goes down to Disney World in November during that weekend. So I was at Disney World with my kids, and my wife had the 2 older ones, and I was with the little one on line to get a picture with the Little Mermaid. And I get a call, and I don't recognize the number, and I answer it. And the person on the other line said, he gave me his name, from Governor Murphy's transition team. The governor had just won. He said, "We're interested in speaking to you about the position of Attorney General." And my reaction was, "Of New Jersey?" And he said, "Yeah, we like what you're doing in Bergen County. Someone's given us your name, and we'd love to sit down with you. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I said, "Well, that's tough. First of all, I had to really make sure."
I'm taking a picture with the Little Mermaid.
Well, I had to step out of line. And so I also had to sort of restrain myself because I thought it was a friend pulling my leg. And then I said, "Okay, I can't come in tomorrow. I'm at Disney, but I'll come in when I get back, which is in a couple of days." And in the meantime, I'm thinking, hopefully I didn't lose the opportunity. He's like, "Can you send me a resume?" And I had to go to the hotel office. I didn't have a resume. That's how happy I was in my current position. That I didn't have an updated resume. So I'm at the one computer at this hotel, creating a resume. People are knocking on the door trying to use the business center. And I went through a long interview process, and I ended up here. And the governor announced me in mid-December. And I spent the first month between mid-December and mid-January winding down my role as the county prosecutor and trying to get ready for this opportunity. You always know in broad strokes what the Attorney General's office does, But when you get here, you know, you could prepare all you want. I think it's been 8 months now. I think I finally have a little bit of handle of everything we do and who's doing it. We have 13 divisions, okay? And so if it was just law enforcement alone, I could handle it, and I expected it. If it was just being the lawyer for the state alone, great. I'm also responsible for the Division of Gaming Enforcement, meaning all the casinos in New Jersey, the Racing Commission, the Boxing Commission, the Juvenile Justice Commission, the state police.
We have a lot of good deputies.
We have great deputies.
Yeah.
The state police, each division director, alcohol and beverage, you know, and I'm missing civil rights. We're sitting in the Division of Consumer Affairs, which has responsibility for all professional licenses in the state, including doctors, nurses, and other licensing boards, including cosmetologists, right? So all the cosmetology licenses, I think, might have my name on it, or might have the division, you know, which is ironic, right? You go to a barber shop and you'll see like Phil Murphy, Sheila Oliver, Paul Rodriguez, and Gurbir Grewal.
That's actually pretty
Yeah,
funny.
and so just the sheer range of it. But what you need to do to be a good manager is have a good team. Right. And I'm lucky that we have an incredible team. We're putting processes in place to ensure that, you know, we're navigating all these issues as well as we can, and addressing everything that filters up, and making sure, you know, not everything can filter up, right?
Right.
And just making sure we have good processes and controls. So,
So
I think the range.
I want to just briefly touch on this one, on the radio incident, and then I want to kind of get, you know, give you space to give advice and thoughts to younger Sikhs. So obviously about 2 months ago, 2 New Jersey hosts said they would not remember your name because you have a turban. Personally, for me, the whole thing was about calling you Turban Man. I think that was like less offensive than saying they literally would not remember your name because you wore a turban. But I wanted to just...
Well, it was also more than that. And they said, listen, if that offends you, then maybe lose a turban and I might remember your name.
Yes, and I think that to me was the offensive part. But I wanted to give you, you know, kind of a different way to address that, because we talked about all those things that you experienced when you were growing up. And my thought was, when they said that, it must have conjured those memories.
100%. I think on a personal level, though, you know, being a public figure for a while now, it didn't directly offend me, right? I wasn't, you know, I wasn't hurt personally by it.
Right.
You know, I've said this before, I have really thick skin, and people have been more creative in what they've called me, and more insulting.
Right.
But what troubled me was, you know, just sort of thinking about, I guess in some way, all those people, you know, who had said that to me in the past, but also, you know, the possibility of people being hurt physically.
Right. One person in New Jersey was stabbed to death recently.
I'm not familiar with that, but what troubled me is that when you look at it in the context in which we're living right now in this moment, right? When we talked about the president and his comments, right? Calling people animals and cockroaches, and dehumanizing people, right? And making it just much more easy to say things about people, and seeing as a law enforcement officer an uptick in bias offenses, not just words, but physical conduct. And, you know, I'm very sensitive, not to the personal attacks, but sensitive to the fact that comments can lead to hateful conduct. And so what concerned me most was that, are they legitimizing somebody who's really close to that edge, legitimizing that person and making him think it's okay for him to do something physical, to act out in a violent way towards somebody? I don't even worry about the violent conduct, because I have the state troopers with me all the time.
Right.
Right. So I don't. You know, I have a detail, but you don't have a detail. Your dad doesn't have a detail.
Right.
You know, Sahib Singh Nath, the 71-year-old in California who was going out for a walk in July, he didn't have a detail. Right. I don't know if, you know, this whole moment pushed those people over the edge and said it's okay to beat up on Sikhs or people who look different. Surjit Singh Mully, you know, a month, you know, between those two incidents, I think a month earlier in July, a 50-year-old who's putting up campaign signs, and who's physically assaulted, and his attackers tell him he doesn't belong here.
Right.
Right. It's that part of it that really bothered me by this whole thing. And that's why I think people with a platform, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a radio show, whether it's us in politics or in public service, we have a responsibility to be better in this moment, because there are so many people teetering on that edge, because we're seeing it in the uptick in hateful conduct, that we just have to be better, all of us, and elevate the rhetoric here and just be mindful of it. You know, hold your beliefs. You know, you could hate me all you want, but you could say it in a responsible manner.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think what it was, you know, usually I'm very pro people being able to take shots at public officials, but the reason why I had an issue with this was because they basically said, if you just stop being who you are, then it's okay. Then you're worth remembering. That's like if Obama went up to Mitt Romney and said, well, maybe I'll address Mitt if he wasn't a Mormon. Right? Like, that just sounds nuts when you even say that out loud.
Yeah, I mean, lose the most visible and meaningful aspect of a Sikh's identity, and then you're worth remembering.
Right. Yeah. And I think the reason why, I think what it is like when you were growing up, that's kind of implicitly how people were thinking. Right. That like maybe we can get ahead if, you know, we abandon our identity, or maybe if we, you know, maybe if we try to like put the sticker on the window, on the window,
the prophylactic patriotism.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, that's I don't even think they truly understood where they were.
Yeah, we fought that pressure. We always thought that was the easiest way to assimilate. Just cut your hair and everything's normal, and you'll be accepted.
Right.
You know, lose the turban.
Right. I want to kind of get into what you think our community. We talked about our community getting into public service. I wanted to start getting into that a little bit before we conclude. Why do you think it's important for our community to get into public service? I know this. You kind of been going around this point, but if you want to address it directly,
I think, you know, if we want to truly, you know, be part and parcel of this country and what it means to be American, I think that's an important step for us to integrate into every aspect, you know, without assimilating and losing our identity completely. But if we really want to be part and parcel, we just can't take all the benefits of the American dream without contributing to it, right? And contributing to it means, you know, paying our deposit in that bank, right? And that's through public service. And it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't have to go be a cop, but, you know, go volunteer, go do something, right? And we do that, and that aligns with Sikh values. But let's just be more proactive about it. And when you see Sikhs out there, whether it's on a volunteer basis, whether it's lawyers doing pro bono immigration work, whether it's, you know, organizing around like a cleanup in a poor neighborhood, those are just such meaningful things. You know, you do it for yourself, for the seva concept of it, for the selfless service, but the residual benefits are just huge, right? And if we start focusing on public service, I just have this belief, because I've seen it, that we could change perceptions, and not even change perceptions, clear away misconceptions. I think it's more, you know, and just really explain to folks who Sikhs are. And if they see, going back to your focus group, if they see Sikhs and understand Sikh beliefs, they'll realize that we're, you know, I've said it before, we believe in a radical egalitarianism, right? Which is so in line with the foundational principles of this country. Right? I can't stress it enough.
People are struck with it when they find out.
I can't stress it enough.
The opposite when they see us.
I mean, we talked about Dr. King in the beginning. I mean, that you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I mean, that's just so in line with everything we do and think about that. We're taught to fight injustice wherever we see it. You know, and so I just think, you know, if we make that final push, whatever rise in hate and intolerance we're seeing in this country is going to subside. And that's not just for Sikhs, it's for all minority communities, I think.
So say you're a young person, a young Sikh, you're 17, 18 years old, and you're listening to this and you want to get into law enforcement or public policy or politics or what have you. What is your advice to them?
So my advice would be, I mean, obviously, if you want to, you know, go to be a prosecutor, you need to go to law school. You need to, you know, go through a series of steps. My advice would be you know, start at the smallest possible level you can, right? Go volunteer at your police department. Go see if they have like a junior explorer program. Go, you know, go do the little things, because I think quite often, you know, we've seen this in our brief immigrant experience here. You know, a Sikh will say, well, I want to run for Congress, right? I'm going to run for Senate, or I'm going to run for, like, you know, state Senate. Yep. And no one understands that you got to pay like small little dues, right? Go, you know, be on your school board. Right. You know, go be on your city council. You know, go be like a mayor. You know, you've got to sort of pay your dues and work your way up. Right. And in the same way, like if you want to be, you know, a cop, you know, the ones that I've hired a lot of cops, and I've seen a lot of troopers come through. It's like an early commitment, you know. It's going through these, you know, junior police camps. It's volunteering and going through, you know, the little steps, you know, that you have to go through to get to that spot. So, you know, look for opportunities, you know, at the local level. Look for opportunities at your prosecutor's offices, internships. You know, really make sure you want to do it. And whatever you decide to do, just do it well. If you don't want to be a public servant, whatever you do, just do it well. Right. You know, and I think if you have that attitude, whatever opportunities are out there will line up for you.
Right. So this is the last question. What are your thoughts on the future of the United States, given how turbulent our politics is?
You know, that's a great question, and I think we are in no doubt in the midst of one of the most challenging crises we've faced. And I don't think I'm overstating it as a democracy. I mean, we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis of epic proportions where, you know, we have a president that has no respect for rules and norms and has no respect for the Constitution, and we have an institution that's supposed to be a check on the president just totally abdicating its role in this process, which is Congress. Yep. And we have the courts, which are now, for a time being, have been a check, and I'm not even hopeful, you know, how long that could sustain, because you're having an influx, a very quick and steady influx of new judges, right? And so it's up to folks like me now to bring lawsuits in the courts to challenge and be a check on the administration. So, you know, it is a very serious crisis, but I am hopeful that we will endure this like we have other tests of this democracy. I think the foundations of our system of government are strong enough to survive this. You know, I'm not a political person in the sense that I didn't run to achieve this office, but I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We have to get involved at a local level. We have to all get involved, whether it's Sikhs, all affected communities who are finding this moment to be difficult and challenging, have to get involved at whatever level they can get involved. Representation at every level matters. Engagement matters more now than ever before. And I am hopeful, based on what I'm seeing, that we will turn this tide and really reclaim this moment. And you know, I've said it before in remarks I've given, that I'm confident that, you know, we will all come together to make America the best version of itself. And that's going to be incumbent on us to do that by getting engaged. And for me, that's doing what I'm doing. For you, that's bringing light to these issues through these discussions and getting the community engaged. For somebody else who's a lawyer, it might be, you know, providing pro bono representation to an immigrant in a deportation case. But we all just have to get engaged. Yep.
Absolutely. Totally agree. This has been great.
Thank you so much. Yeah. This is amazing.
Yeah.
We'll, maybe we could check back in down the road.
Absolutely.
All right.
Good luck.
All right.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.